Before we get into using Adobe Camera Raw, also known as ACR, I first want to talk about RAW versus JPEG. Most people think that Adobe Camera Raw is only for processing RAW files. However, you can also process your JPEG files in ACR as well. So why would you want to do that? Well, there are some features in ACR for editing your JPEG files that give you more creative options versus what's just available in Photoshop itself. So first, let's go over the differences between RAW and JPEG, the pros and cons of each, and then you can decide which format is best for your workflow. Plus, I'll give you my own personal opinion. It doesn't matter what type of camera you have, you should have the option to shoot in RAW or JPEG. So what does RAW stand for? Well, RAW stands for really artistic work. No, not really. Even though camera companies often refer to them as RAW files, RAW really doesn't stand for anything like JPEG does. JPEG stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group, which is the name of the organization that agreed to that standard. So what exactly is a RAW file? Well, a RAW file consists of the raw image data taken by your camera's sensor. It also captures the information about the camera raw settings and the processing parameters set at the time the file was recorded. That being said, there is no difference between a JPEG file and a RAW file at the time of capture. Not until it goes through your camera's processor does it actually affect the file. So let's take a closer look at this. If you're shooting in RAW, your camera's sensor will capture the information, send it through your camera's processor, and at the same time, it will save that data information that includes your white balance, your color space, your bit depth, your exposure, and other basic info about your image in the metadata of your file. Now let's compare that to a JPEG file. There's really no difference between a RAW and JPEG file until it goes through your camera's processor and saved to your memory card. So when shooting in JPEG, your camera sensor will capture the exact same information as it does a RAW file. The difference is when it goes through the processor of your camera, it will take all that data information, your white balance, your color space, JPEG parameters, bit depth, exposure, everything else into consideration, and it's going to compress it and combine all those things into your file. So your camera's processor is actually editing your photo in camera before saving it to the memory card. So what does all this mean? It simply means that your RAW file is storing all the information and allowing you the ability to edit your image based on more information. A JPEG file cannot store the same information processed by RAW files. So your JPEG file has undergone some type of in-camera processing at some level of compression, and your camera is telling you what information is important. It's going to throw away some of that information in order to compress it into a JPEG file. So if you want more control over your images, I would recommend RAW files. If you're confident about your ability to capture the proper exposure, white balance, and everything else about the photo that you're taking, then you can save it in JPEG file. But just remember, you have fewer data information about that file in case you need to go back and to adjust it. So if your exposure is off or if the white balance is off, it's going to be harder to color correct that image. Now, unlike JPEG files, RAW files require a post-processing software in order to edit the file. Most camera makers, Canon, Nikon, and some of the others, provide their own software for editing photos based on their file format. There are other programs out there that can edit RAW files as well, and each one processes the files differently from the original manufacturers. The two most popular are Adobe Lightroom, and Adobe Camera Raw, which is also known as ACR, and it's part of Photoshop. We are not going to go into the details of the other types in this chapter. Instead, we will just focus on ACR. Another main difference between RAW and JPEG is file size. Since the raw data information is storing everything about the file, a RAW file will be much larger than a JPEG file. It all depends on your camera's sensor, and it could be as much as 10 to 20 times larger. This larger file size means that your memory card is going to fill up much faster, and it's going to take up more space on your computer's hard drive. Plus, your camera's processor is going to take longer in order to process the file and save it to your memory card. Now you may be thinking you would prefer to have a JPEG file because you can get more photos on your memory card and your computer. However, choosing a JPEG file means you are sacrificing a lot of the information about your photo when captured. So when you go to edit your JPEG file, you will have less information for which to work with, and thereby making your editing process more challenging. Unless, of course, you're shooting a location that can be perfectly captured as far as exposure goes for highlights and shadows. So if you have an overcast scene, then you'll have a better chance of capturing all the highlights and shadow details. So if you shoot a scene that has a high amount of highlights and shadows, the dynamic range captured by a JPEG will be much smaller than a RAW file. A RAW file is capable of capturing a much higher dynamic range versus JPEG. This is because the information captured about your scene is capturing data in the highlights and shadows and saving that information into the RAW file. This just simply means you can correct your highlights and shadows much easier with the RAW file than you can with the JPEG file. I personally recommend shooting RAW files, especially if you're new to photography and some of the terms that I've used in this lesson don't really make sense to you yet, then you should shoot RAW files. As you become more experienced and learn how to properly expose your images without using any of your camera's auto settings, which means shooting manually, versus letting your camera choose for you. Once you become more experienced and you're able to manually capture your photos with the proper exposure and white balance, you can then start shooting in JPEG depending on the project that you're working on. So to recap, there's not much difference between a RAW and JPEG file until your camera starts to process that file. Your JPEG files are going to be compressed and thereby have less information for editing later on, compared to a RAW file that is not compressed during your camera's processing, and the information is actually stored in the metadata of your file, thereby giving you more information to correct and edit your photo at a later time. My recommendation for new photographers and even experienced photographers is to shoot in RAW.